Our scripture reading this morning comes from Acts chapter 7, verses 9 through 16. Acts chapter 7, verses 9 through 16. And the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him, and delivered him out of all his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now there came a dearth all over the land of Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was a corn in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. Oh my goodness, hold me. Oh my goodness. Fathers first. And at the second time Joseph was known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known unto the Pharaoh. Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred 75 souls. So Jacob went down to Egypt and died, he and his fathers, and were carried over into Sychem, and laid in the sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money for the sons of Emor, the father of Sychem.
Our study this morning is going to be based out of the book of Genesis. I had Brother Ralph read the occasion in Acts chapter 7, that Stephen, by inspiration, had summed up in just a few words the greatness of God working through this man. And our lesson title this morning, let me get this to work with the other hand, The Lord Was With Him. The latter part of the book of Genesis is dedicated to the life and family of Joseph. In fact, it's the last 14 chapters of 50 chapters are dedicated to Joseph and his family. Only one chapter that really has nothing to do with Joseph. It's just like a parenthetical chapter, and it was between the event of him being sold off into slavery and then picking it back up with him in Egypt. But I wanted to look with you at some things in this reading, or the history of this man. We're not going to read 14 chapters of Genesis this morning, but you also probably know the storyline very well. But I do want to draw your attention to some things that I think are worthy to point out and maybe make some application for our own lives. And the first thing is, Joseph learned that when one walks with God, that God blesses them even in their adversity. That's something that he had learned, and he went through some very difficult challenges in coming to that realization. The story begins in Genesis chapter 37. If you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. It sets the stage with Jacob and his family dwelling in a land where his father was a stranger, says, talking about Abraham. Remember, Abraham was the sojourner. He was called out of Ur of the Chaldees and was to travel through this land, but he would live in tents. He would never make a permanent home of Canaan. But the promise was from God that someday I'm going to give your heritage this land. And Jacob here also dwelling in tents. This was still not the time in which the land was given to them, but this is where they were living, in the land of Canaan. I want you to notice here that Joseph was 17 years old when the storyline picks up. It doesn't really talk about his youth except from that point forward. Gives a little bit of the genealogy of his situation, but Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob that was born in his old age, and so he doted on Joseph. He actually favored Joseph, and that's never a good thing to do in a family unit, to have a favorite child, and it just doesn't set a good tone. And you can see it just didn't go well here for Joseph either, and they noticed that. They noticed that it began with Dad. It began with his favor of him. He made him a coat of many colors. He didn't make anything for them. And then to make matters worse, he had two dreams that ultimately had to do with somehow, in these dreams, that you all are going to bow down to me. First, it had to do with his brothers. They would bow down to me, talking about the sheaves that would be gathered and that his sheaves would stand upright, but their sheaves would all bow down to him. They understood what it meant. They didn't need somebody to give any kind of interpretation. They understood immediately You're suggesting that we're going to bow down to you? And it says they hated him even more. And he talked about how they couldn't even speak to him peaceably because they hated him so much. And then he had that other dream when he talks about the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. Well, he says that in the presence of his father. His father understood the interpretation too. Sun and moon is mom and dad, and the 11 stars are his 11 brothers, and they're all older than him as far as down to that point. And he said, you're all going to bow down to me. And they hated him even more. But his father kept these things in his heart. And so we pick up the storyline with the first bit of adversity he had to deal with. Because the Lord was with Joseph when he was treated treacherously by his brothers. Beginning in verse 18, we want to read, now when they saw him afar off, and the history of that is that they went out tending their father's flock, and they were in a region far enough from home that his father sent him to go check on them. And so Joseph goes to check on his brothers, and when he finally finds them, it says they saw him afar off from a distance. Even before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Now, I'm familiar with sibling rivalry, having 4 brothers. I'm familiar with that on a small scale. I know what it's like to maybe be irritated or agitated, or maybe think that you don't like your siblings or something like that. Maybe you even fight once in a while. But I have no concept of what it would be like to see a brother of mine from a distance, no matter how mad I was at him, and think, I want to kill him and take his life. It seems foreign to me, but it's not foreign to Scripture. Second generation of man. You can't even get past the second generation of man. You got one brother stands up and kills his own brother. Cain slays Abel, his brother. And so that mindset evidently was certainly in the mind of Joseph's brothers. And they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. This is mockery. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we'll just say, some wild beast has devoured him. And we shall see what will become of his dreams. It sounds a little bit, honestly, like the mockery of the scribes and the Pharisees, the chief priests and the elders when Jesus was on the cross. They said, come down from the cross, we'll believe in you. Saved others, he can't save himself. It's very similar, I think, in the way their attitude was toward him. We'll see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands. The Holy Spirit saw fit to write it that way. If it weren't for Reuben, he would have died that day, is the implication. But Reuben intervened and tried to, he didn't try to rebuke him. He tried to steer it in a different direction. But in so doing, he delivered Joseph out of the hands of murder. And he says, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him. And it goes on to say that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. That was his motive for saying that. So it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers that they had stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into the pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted up their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. Change of heart over money, evidently. And his brothers listened. I wonder what great delight they took in ripping that robe off of him. Every time they saw him wear it, I'm sure it was just like acid in an acid burn, salt in the wound every day, always reminding them of how he was favored by the Father, and the great joy, the delight that they took in this conspiracy here. You know, they wanted to kill him. Let's just snuff him out. We'll see what happens to these dreams. But then when the thought of profit was to come to mind, well, then that changed things. It changed things. Let's see what kind of profit we can make off of this. You know, God forbid we should take his life now. So the Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit. Evidently Reuben wasn't with him when all this happened. And indeed, Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and I, where shall I go? So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? I want to pause just a minute to ask this question. Imagine that you're in that group of people who's trying to pull off this conspiracy. How good of a liar are you? You know that it's Joseph's tunic. You ripped it off of him. What's more is you've seen this on his body for some time. Not likely that there's another one like it anywhere around. You couldn't just run down to Jew Mart and buy one, okay? It was not something that, it was a one-of-a-kind deal. Is this your son's tunic? They knew full well. How in the world could they look him in the eye and say that? And he recognized it, and he said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." So they didn't have to tell the lie. It was more like they just kind of led him to believe something happened, and then Jacob took the assumption himself. And Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his waist and mourned for his sons many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Before I read the last verse, one other thing, what's so powerful to me about chapter 37, how this ends, is not only the treachery of his brothers, but to know, they had to know this was going to be crushing to their father. But they were willing to do it anyway. Their bitter hatred toward Joseph was so strong, it outweighed their concern and love for their father. I wonder if they were tormented day unto day by seeing the grief on this man's face. Maybe he was aging by the day. It looked like years as the days would go by. Here's a man who was tortured because he thought his son was dead, and they stood by and said nothing. What kind of people is this? Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Chapter 38 is the parenthetical chapter, so we're going to go right to chapter 39. In 39 it says in verse 1, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there." And this is the first time it says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with Joseph, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put in his hand. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's hand. And he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. And Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." Now that sets the stage for the next little bit. But up to that point, it talks about that he trusted Joseph so much, and Joseph put him in such a high position, he didn't worry about the daily details anymore. He didn't know really what he had. He knew he had. He was only aware of what was on his dinner plate at night. But Joseph had everything else covered. That's nice. Wouldn't everybody like to have somebody like that in your life? They got everything covered. All the bills are paid. You don't have to worry about where the money's coming from. Somebody's figured this all out for you. You just kind of live an easier life. But see, Joseph was elevated to that point because God was with him. To be dealt with as treacherously as his brothers had done so. But yet the Lord did not abandon him in that misery. And wherever it was he went, God was with him. But notice that God didn't shield him from the misery. God didn't stop the process in which his brothers were going to kill him, or especially when they sold him into slavery. He still ended up going into slavery into Egypt. He ended up in this guy's house and serving him and his family. God didn't prevent that from happening. He allowed it to happen. He tolerated it. But while he was there, he blessed Joseph in such a way that he was exalted before him. And so, that's just the first part of it. It actually gets worse because the adversity in his life is bad enough whenever you're just betrayed, by those that you should be able to trust. But then to be wrongfully accused and put in prison for something you've never done, this is just getting worse. So remember, he's handsome in form and appearance. That means he had a nice-looking body and a nice-looking face, basically. That's the idea. He was attractive to the women folk. Now, verse 7, it says, "Now it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in this house, and he has committed all that he has into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time, when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." That he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought in this Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me." And I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened, when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until her master came home. Now, if you didn't know the former portion of that, is it possible that the latter portion would be true? Does that sound like a reasonable thing that could have happened? Could this woman have been just minding her own business, and she was a good person, and Joseph, who was trusted, when he saw nobody was around, took advantage of the situation? But she wasn't a willing participant, so she cries out, and then he just doesn't know what to do and takes off and runs in such haste he basically forgets his garment. So that's just like the smoking gun. That's Exhibit A against him. This is his garment. That's the second time somebody would probably ask, "Is this your garment?" It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? It's so easy to set someone up with a lie, because all you have to do is present a situation that sounds rational and reasonable, and you've won half the battle. Then it's just down to whether somebody believes in you or not. But he had nobody there to believe in him, because he's a Hebrew. He's working for the Egyptians. But the truth is, he repelled her every day. It doesn't say whether he was tempted or not. It doesn't say whether she was good looking or not. It doesn't say anything other than, regardless of who she was or what she looked like, that he absolutely was saying no. And the most important point was, how can I do this, commit this great sin and this great wickedness against God? See, he viewed this as not just something he'd do to her or her household or whatever, but this was an affront to God. So here's a man of integrity, but he still gets in trouble. What's that old saying? No good deed goes unpunished. Now, a lot of people would feel like if I try to do good all the time, but I keep suffering for it, then what's the point of doing good? What's the point of trying so hard? These are the tests of life. Because sometimes it might seem that you're not being favored by God for some reason whenever you try to do the right thing, but that's simply not true. Joseph suffered more than in worse ways than what we have. He never left the point of integrity with God. He just trusted in God. But when his master came home and heard it, and maybe he's never caught his wife in a lie before. And here's a woman that kept pestering him. He kept saying no, no, no. And finally, that final rejection was so bitter to her. What is it they say? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. This would be a perfect example of that. And he paid the price for her scorn. Because when the master came home, he didn't believe Joseph. He believed his wife. Your servant did to me after this manner. And his anger was roused. So she told the story her way, spun it her way. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. He was a political prisoner, in other words. But notice what it says the second time, but the Lord was with him. The Lord was with Joseph and showed mercy to him. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's hand, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. It's a very similar repeating theme. When he was over Potiphar's household, he didn't even bother to look into anything anymore, because he prospered so well and trusted Joseph, and he received such a blessing. It doesn't go on to say, but I've often wondered, after he was thrown into prison, I wonder if everything tanked at Potiphar's house. It's like, well, the crops were looking good last week. What happened here? All these Egyptian beetles are eating up all the leaves. And it doesn't say that. I wonder about that. Did the blessing obviously go with Joseph wherever he was? That's where the blessing was. Kind of like the Ark of the Covenant that David tried to move on the new cart instead of doing it God's way. The way it's prescribed, he tried to do it a different way, and it cost Uzzah his life. So instead of continuing the journey, he just puts it in the basically the on the property of another guy there, and it says that while the ark was there, he flourished. The blessings were galore, right? That's the same thing with Joseph. Joseph learned that when one walks with God, no matter the adversity, God will bless them. No matter how hard it gets and how dark the days may seem, and no matter what what difficulty you live through, if you continue to walk with God in the integrity that he had and uprightness of heart, God is with you. And something that we'll notice is that that's a fine message. We could end it there, but there's more to the story, because Joseph also learned that redemption comes when the time is right on God's timetable. Remember, God did not prevent this from happening. He did not prohibit or prevent his brother from selling him into slavery. He did not prohibit nor prevent Potiphar's wife falsely accusing him, or Potiphar throwing him into prison. He was in prison, and he's going to stay there a while. Because there came a certain point, it doesn't say how long he was in there. He was in there for some time, and during his sojourn in prison, during his time there were two other people that were among Pharaoh's household, if you will, according to his court, that were thrown in there. Pharaoh himself was angry with them and cast them into prison for a time. One was his chief butler, and the other his chief baker. And they were in custody for a while, verse 4 says. But then there came a point when the butler and the baker actually they dreamed a dream on the same night. They dreamed a dream, different dreams. The butler had one and the baker had one. And Joseph comes in and notices in verse 6, saw that they were sad, and he asked him, why so sad? Why the sad look today? And so they explained, well, we've both had a dream, we have no way to interpret it. The long story short is this: both of them gave Joseph the dream. Joseph says, it implies that the interpretation of dreams comes from God. He says the same thing to Pharaoh later. God gets the glory, but he interprets it for them. And the bottom line is that one of them's going to live and the other one's going to die. The one is going to be reinstated, and they will both be released on the same day, because according to their dreams, Joseph said the interpretation is 3 days from now, you're both going to be taken out of prison, and Pharaoh's going to lift you up, basically here you come out of prison, but he's going to exalt one of you back to your former status, and the other one he's going to kill. So he lets the butler know that you're going to be reinstated. You're going to have Pharaoh's cup in your hand as it was in former times. It's all going to be good. Well, at this point, the baker also heard this, and he's like, oh, his interpretation turned out good. So what's my dream going to be like? And that's when he gives him the bad news that you're going to be beheaded and your body hanged. Okay. But the thing is what Joseph said was absolutely accurate. The interpretation would turn out to be true. But I want you to notice that God still allows him to be in prison. He is still in prison, and there's nothing prohibiting him from prohibiting that. But in verses 14 and 15, Joseph makes this plea. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. I shouldn't even be in this land. And even in being in this land, I shouldn't be in prison. I have done nothing wrong, which probably every prisoner says. What are you in here for? I didn't do anything. But he really didn't do anything wrong. He was set up. Well, notice verse 23. Remember, verse 22, that Pharaoh had hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had interpreted. Verse 23, yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Remember when you're reinstated, please remember me to Pharaoh. Please, speak my name to him. And, I need to get out here. Do me this favor. Can you do me a solid and do that? But he forgot about him. And it says in chapter 41 of verse 1, then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. 2 full years had passed since the time that the butler and the baker had been in prison. Again, I don't know how long he was in there. I have no idea how long he was in there. But I do know this. Verse 46 of chapter 41 says that Joseph was 30 years old when he first stood before Pharaoh. How old was he when he was tending his father's flock? How old was he when he had the dreams? How old was he when his brothers sold him into slavery? He was 17 at the beginning of the story. So he might have still been 17 when he was sold into slavery, 18, maybe he was 19 or 20. Seems to imply it was all within roughly the same basic time frame. He's not out of prison until he's 30. So I don't know. How long was he, a master over Potiphar's house and possessions and whatnot? It doesn't say how long it was from that beginning point to the time he got out of prison, but somewhere in that long length of time, he had been in Potiphar's house and then been in prison for quite a while. Either way you look at it, he was not in the best situation for all those years. But it was not to be yet. It was not to be that Joseph would be taken out of prison until 2 years would pass. Pharaoh had a dream, and his dream was it was really profound. It had the 7 fat cows coming out of the river. They look good, they're grazing, and then right after that is the 7 gaunt-looking, skinny cows. They come up, and what's more is in the dream, the skinny ones eat the fat ones. And so he had a similar dream that with the heads of grain, the stalks of grain, same thing. The ones that were full and the ones that were gaunt looking, and the grain was the horrible looking grain was eating the good grain. And he called together his magicians, he called together his philosophers. Nobody could figure it out. And finally, verse 9, the chief butler of chapter 41, the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh saying, remember my faults this day. Came to him then. He had forgotten to keep his promise to Joseph to tell Pharaoh about him. And so he goes on to explain, when Pharaoh was angry with me and with the baker, and you cast us into prison, and we both had a dream, and there was this Hebrew in prison with us, and he interpreted our dreams, and they came true just as he said. Verse 14 says, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. Always loved that verse. He presented himself as best he could before the king. And so he's finally before Pharaoh. He finally gets his opportunity. He interprets the dreams and suggests to him, both the dreams are the same. They are one. And that is, you're going to have 7 years of plenty. Everything's going to be really good. But following that, God's going to bring 7 years of severe famine in the land. That's the interpretation of the dream. And basically suggested to him, this is what I would do. Set someone up that's going to oversee this. And for the 7 years of good, take 1/5 of all the produce of the land and store it up. So that when the 7 years of famine come, that you'll be able to live. You'll be able to survive the 7 years of drought. And so Pharaoh was so impressed that Joseph could not only interpret the dreams, but even with the wisdom with which he spoke. The wisdom of God, he says. That he actually elevates Joseph over all of Egypt. Notice with me verse 37. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and the eyes of all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. You are the most powerful man in all of Egypt, except for me. You are under me. But that's it. You are over everything. Verse 41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he said, and they cried out before him, bow the knee! So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Could you imagine going from rags to riches? Because God was with him. The Lord was with him through all that adversity, and finally being able to come out of prison, out of he was there in a wrongful manner. He's finally elevated, and it's basically it's poetic justice time for his life. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his foot or hand in the land of Egypt. Now that's some serious power. Wow. The end. Get out your hymn books. Rags to riches. That's the story of Jesus. That's the story of God. That's the story of... No, the story doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. But what it does tell us is, again, Joseph was 30 years old, it says, when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And it talks about other blessings that were given to him. He was given a wife. He had children. But that's really the beginning of the story. All of that was like a preface to what was really important. But none of that happened overnight. God didn't just jump in and take care of the matter. It had to happen overnight. A span of time would pass. It's just like, why did it take 2 years from the time that he interpreted the dreams of the baker and the butler? Why did it take 2 years for that to happen? Yeah, it's true. It's true the man forgot about Joseph until Pharaoh had a dream, and he's like, oh, that rings a bell. I remember this guy. But what good might that have done if he goes and talks to Pharaoh about Joseph and, well, there's this guy that really helped us out in prison there. Maybe he would have been released from prison. Maybe there would have been some blessing in that. But God knew that at the right time, when he was going to give or make Pharaoh have those dreams, because that was an act of God, those dreams were miraculous. That at just the right time, there would be the dreams. And at just that time, Joseph enters stage right. God knew exactly when the right time was. Now, it's not likely Joseph would have been elevated to the highest point over Egypt. He might have been blessed. He might have been released from prison, but he would not be in the position he's in now. It took this really phenomenal thing to happen, that at the right time when Joseph not only gives the interpretation, but speaks so wisely, the king is so blown away, Pharaoh's so blown away. He's like, you are my man. I trust you with everything. He was so blown away by this. This is the only event that would catapult Joseph to the level God needed him to be at for our final point. And that is, Joseph also learned that sometimes God has a bigger purpose in mind for all the pain in life that one endures. This wasn't just about Joseph. We've talked about one guy so far. This isn't just about Joseph. God was with Joseph. He walked with Joseph because Joseph walked with him. He blessed Joseph even in a time of adversity. We could end the story anywhere and say it was a really good storyline. It was a really good message from the Bible. But he had something bigger in mind. This wasn't just about saving Joseph. It wasn't just about blessing Joseph. There was something much, much larger at stake here. We go over to chapter 45. By this point, famine had already hit the land, and his brothers, most of them, were sent down to Egypt by their father. Jacob says, go to Egypt. There's grain down there. That's what they've been hearing all up and down, north, south, east, and west. There's grain in Egypt. We have no idea Jacob has no idea that the reason there's grain in Egypt because of his son Joseph, he thinks is dead. So he sends everybody but the youngest one, Benjamin. And they come to Egypt, and Joseph recognizes them. But they don't recognize Joseph. Now, why would they? First of all, for all they know, he's dead. Second of all, he was sold into the poverty of slavery. There's no way that this officer over them got it as him. They didn't recognize him, but he knew who they were. It says that he spoke roughly with them at first. He even accuses them of being spies. And to test them on that, he says, you go back and I'm going to keep one of you here. They kept them all in prison for like 3 days. And he said, I'm going to keep one of you here. The rest of you go back. You bring your youngest brother here as proof. I want to see the proof that you're not lying. Because they talked about when he talked about his family, he says, I have a father. There was 12 of us. One of us is no more. Telling the guy that is no more that he's no more. And there's one at home, the youngest. Well, see, that's Joseph's brother too, but he's from the same mom. And so he wants to see Benjamin. But he plays it off like, I believe you're spies, and I'm going to keep one of you here, and he's going to be my slave until you come back with him. And so they go back, and there's this, they go back, and the money they took to pay for the grain, Joseph commanded his servants, leave the money in the top of the sack. So when they get back, they're scared. They're like, what? We're supposed to pay for this. We still have the money. So now it's like they might have stolen it somehow. And long story short, they finally come down, they bring Benjamin. And it says that in verse 1 of chapter 45, he's played with this for quite a while. He's played with this for quite a while. And it says, Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers finally. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. You think? They have no clue he's even alive. And they've been mistreated by him, they think. They made him jump through some hoops and everything, and so he finally says, "I'm Joseph. I'm your brother. Hey, is Dad still alive?" I mean, which one of them would be like, "Hey, that's pretty cool to see. Yeah, Daddy's doing good." You know, that's not how it happened, right? They just completely was just stumped. It's probably an out-of-body experience right now. This is surreal to them. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." And they came near. And he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life." What? Joseph understood. Maybe not at the beginning, maybe not at the middle of it, but he understood at this point the reason he had to go there. The reason it happened the way it happened, and the outcome the result that was going to come from that. Because that famine that hit the land, if they don't get help from Egypt, they're all going to die. And so God prepared for his entire family. The book of Exodus basically begins where Genesis leaves off with this story, that by the time everybody comes down and the families that build up to like 70 people, including all the children, the wives and everything. God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, so 2 of the 7's already passed. And there's still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. I want you to focus on that statement. That Joseph, it was them that sent him there. They were the ones. Their hands are guilty, as it were, with the blood of his life if he had been slain. Whatever happened to him, they did it. They chose to do it. But Joseph viewed it this way. God allowed it to happen to result in your life. This was to the saving of your life as it is this day. God sent me before you. It was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. I've been elevated to this point. Kind of leaves the impression that Pharaoh might have been a bit younger maybe than Joseph at this point. I'm a father to Pharaoh, he says. And then notice here, if you go over to chapter 50, the last chapter of Genesis, at this point, Jacob, who had died in Egypt, he says, "Please do not bury me here. Take me back and bury me in our land." And he gets permission from Pharaoh, and they go up, and it's a big deal. They go up and they bury Jacob. They come back. Joseph kept his promise. But then Joseph is about to die as well. And the interesting about Joseph is after he dies, now he is going to be buried, temporarily in Egypt. And he would stay there until after the Exodus, because the Hebrews, who are going to thrive for a while, will eventually become the slaves of the Egyptians, and they'll be in bondage for 430 years. And then when Moses, by God through Moses, had delivered them from Egyptian bondage, they carried up the bones of Joseph and took those with them. But he isn't dead yet. When the brothers, in verse 15 of chapter 50, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him." So now they're thinking it's only because of Dad that he kept us alive, but now he's going to repay us. So they sent messengers to Joseph saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father.'" Now Joseph, when he read this, he wept, or when they spoke to him, he wept. They still weren't quite getting it. And it says in verse 18, "Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' And Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid, For am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me. You did. You meant evil against me whenever you wanted to kill me. And you put me in that pit. And then you meant evil against me whenever you sold me off into slavery. Pretty sure you'd never see me again. I was not even a footnote in your life anymore. You meant evil when you did that against me. But God meant it for good. He allowed it to happen, and He played that history out to where it would actually benefit you on this day, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And He comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph went to his grave in love with his family, in love with his brothers, and he did not hold any bitterness against them. Amazing, this life this man had lived. Joseph must have sinned at some point in his life, because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But interestingly, in 14 chapters, I don't remember reading one place where he actually committed a sin. He needed a Savior. But what a man. What a man. Joseph learned that when one walks with God, God blesses them even in their adversity. Joseph learned that redemption comes when the time is right in God's timetable. Joseph learned that sometimes whatever's happened, I'll word it this way, whatever's happening in your life, whatever pain you're enduring, it might just be that God has something bigger in mind than you. I want to share this with you because I think this is a good motivator for the rest of our lives, to realize, first of all, it's doubtful that almost any of us are going to experience what he experienced. Good, high or low, good or bad or ugly. But one thing is for certain, whatever we do go through in life, if we walk with God every step of the way, God will bless us, even though He may allow the hardships to come. There might be times when the challenges are so great, you just wonder what's next. You have no idea if you're going to be able to survive for some reason. It might be very difficult for you to comprehend just exactly what God has in mind for your future. But one thing is for sure, that even if it is hard, even if the days are dark, if you walk with Him, He will bless you wherever you are. Funny, isn't it, how sometimes you wonder how you're going to make ends meet, let's say, something like that. You're doing the math, and you're like, I don't think we're going to do it this month. I know we're going to have to sell something. How many kids we have? Sell one off, got like 4 left, But somehow, some way, because you put God first in your life, you seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, He takes care of those material needs. And at the end of it, you might not even be able to justify it by the books. You can't even figure out exactly. You just look at it, like, wow, we got through it. God saw us through. And in whatever God's timetable is for maybe some great thing to happen in our life, it'll be in His time. That's what we sing, right? In His time, in His time. He makes all things beautiful in His time. And we trust God in that, no matter how long it is. Maybe I'll go to the end of my life never seeing the greater thing. But one thing I do know is I'm going to go see the greatest thing, and that is something that's beyond this life. Whatever blessing that we get in this life is temporal at best. Joseph couldn't take it with him. He wasn't head over Egypt, all of those, till the end of time. He eventually died. The greatest blessing of all, God promises to give, eternal life. And no one and no thing can take that from you if you're willing to be faithful and walk with Him every day. Whenever that is, it is. And sometimes the things that we have to go through, it just might be that God has something in mind for other people. Maybe you did suffer, or maybe you are suffering in some way. You're struggling. Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe whatever the adversity is you're going through. I suggest that we look for blessings every day. If you find yourself in unfamiliar territory, then maybe there's something in that territory that needs exposure to the glory of God, and you're the one through whom that glory is going to be shining. Whatever it is, embrace the idea that God is not always singular in His work. He can deal with you, and me, and all this, and weave it together in such a way that we can be benefited in our individual lives, but at the same time, He brings about some great good that involves more people than we might even realize. I love what I read in the life of Joseph. The Bible is full of really solid, strong examples of reasons why we should walk by faith, but this one here just stands out to me. Not just because of so many chapters dedicated to his life. It is just a powerful message from God. God hasn't changed. The blessings are still there. God is still real. And so I want to encourage you along those lines. The Lord was with him. Now this morning there might be someone who's not even a Christian, who is not even walking with God. I want you to notice that the blessings were given to Joseph were not given to people who weren't God's people. If anyone that wasn't God's people were blessed, it was because it was through Joseph the blessing came. Potiphar's house, he was the keeper in the prison. All of Egypt, when he was elevated, it was because of Joseph. God's blessing of Joseph blessed those around him. If you're not a child of God, we encourage you to really think about that this morning. If you are a child of God and you have not been walking with God as you should, we want to encourage you to do that, because you're really no different than the person I just spoke of 30 seconds ago. It doesn't do any good to be a Christian in name only, but to walk the talk, they say. If you want God in your life, then be in His. Draw near to God and He'll draw near to you, James says. We encourage you to do that this morning if you'll be subject to heaven's call. Brother Bob's going to lead us in an invitation song, the title of which is Have Thine Own Way. Have Thine Own Way. That's our appeal to God, to have His way with us. And so we want to open our hearts to the Lord right now. If you have any desire to respond to the gospel call, why don't you do that right now while we stand and sing.